Welcome back to MotionPic Recap. Today we're going to recap the adventure, action and comedy movie titled, My Fellow Americans. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. A TV reporter explains the hate between the Republican nominee Kramer and the Democratic nominee Douglas continues, but that one will have to salute the other as the next president of the United States. Next, Kramer has won and tells his supporters he's confident he'll be there for a long time. But then 4 years later, Kramer has to step down as Douglas is voted into office. 4 years later again, Douglas is voted out of office, and the new President Haney takes over. 3 years later, at the present, President Kramer is supporting a Japanese insurance company, when suddenly a panda comes up dancing with him. Afterwards, Kramer tells his assistant that Jefferson didn't dance with a bear, and Reagan didn't foxtrot with a friggin' panda, saying angrily he doesn't dance with animals either. Somewhere else, a woman called Joanna remarks she can't believe she did it with President Douglas. Being his editor, Douglas asks what she thinks about his book, and she replies he spoke too much about what he wanted to do instead of what he did, and Douglas responds that's because he didn't do much. He remarks however that he'll never be like Kramer, running around sucking up every dime he finds. Next, Douglas is on his way to a funeral. He steps on Air Force One to be taken to it, when he suddenly sees Kramer. Still not liking each other, Douglas mocks Kramer, asking if you dance with a panda, who leads. The two then quickly begin fighting over who was more popular, comparing who got more assassination attempts than the other. At the funeral, they continue, and even more nasty, and Douglas tells Kramer to admit he's a whore, and Kramer replies asking Douglas to name one woman he didn't bang in the White House. Meanwhile at the White House, President Haney is informed the Democrats have some damaging information about Olympia, something Haney remarks they've had buried for years. The man tells Haney it took place when Kramer was president, and so they can lay the scandal on him. Haney says Kramer didn't know anything about that, but the man says they can fiddle with the records and make it appear he did, which Haney doesn't like. The man says more than the presidency is at stake if he doesn't do anything. 2 weeks later at a party, Kramer is informed by his favorite TV news person Kay Griffin that a rumor has it a scandal is about to blow which may involve him. Kramer says his nose is clean, but she says she heard he took a very generous offer his last year in office for delivering a big defense contract. In another part of the room, Douglas is informed by the Democratic chairman Joe about the rumor too, how a scandal may blow, which he helped to bury. Kramer asks his wife rhetorically who stands to benefit from framing him, when suddenly President Haney arrives at the party. Next, Kramer asks his assistant to find who the contractor he supposedly made a deal with in office is. The presidents are doing a tour, and as Douglas is distracted by a girl flirting, he walks up to her, asking Kramer to hold his club, and then gives her a kiss. He then hands Kramer $1 for his help, and Kramer calls Douglas a son of a bitch. A day later, Kramer is informed that the presidential appointment log notes he was alone with a contractor called Charlie Reynolds once, having a meeting called Olympia. Next, Kramer visits Charlie Reynolds, telling him Haney was at that meeting too, that it's gonna be hard for him and his buddies to explain how they tampered with official documents in the National Archives. Charlie just replies he doesn't know what he's talking about. As Kramer leaves, Douglas arrives. Charlie is surprised he's visited by another president, and Douglas asks them to take a walk. Douglas asks Charlie who he'll say took the kickback, saying if it's Kramer he'll give him a big kiss on the mouth. Next, Charlie calls a man named Carl, saying they came to his office yesterday, that if he knew this would happen, he'd never have signed. Carl says he's got the White House behind him, after which Carl tells a man that Charlie sounded shaky. A week later, Douglas is at a book convention when he suddenly sees Kramer selling a cookbook. Joanna remarks Kramer cooked for his staff in the White House, but Douglas says it's shameful, remarking George Washington never wrote a book called 30 Days to a Slimmer Ass. Suddenly a woman gives him a book, in which Charlie has sent a message to meet him alone. To sneak away, he tricks his bodyguards to grab a poor young guy he finds suspicious, and he quickly runs away. He's followed by someone, and when he gets to Charlie's car, the man yells his name, scaring Douglas, but pulls out some papers. He takes a look and sees it's from his ex-wife, telling Charlie never to get a divorce, getting into the car, but then sees Charlie shot. Kramer appears, and seeing Charlie's dead, Kramer asks what he did. Douglas sarcastically says they argued about his cookbook and so he plugged him, and Kramer asks upset if he's got a problem with his cookbook. Douglas says they need to talk somewhere else. They go home to Kramer, where they discuss the situation. Suddenly, Kramer's daughter appears with a man called Colonel Tanner to see them. He introduces himself, saying he's from NSA and that President Haney wants to see them immediately. They ask how they knew they were there, and Tanner says it's their business to know where they are. Next, they are brought to the White House. Several hours later, Douglas calls the pilots, saying he didn't remember this route to Camp David. The pilots answer they were not told to go to Camp David, and that Haney is at the White House. Douglas remarks something is wrong. The two appear in the cockpit and force them to land the chopper at gunpoint. Douglas tells Kramer to get out so they can discuss, and the pilots remark it's their butt if they let them out of sight, starting to follow them. Kramer suddenly calls Douglas an idiot, that they could have just threatened the pilots to fly them to the White House. But then suddenly, the chopper explodes. Hours later, Kramer remarks President Haney must be behind this, saying they must go public with this. Somewhere else, Tanner makes a call, saying unless the presidents are dead in the chopper, he wants them found. Douglas says he's hungry, and Kramer gives him food, saying he owes him. Douglas remarks it's a penny, that he's a cheap son of a bitch. Kramer then gets an idea, remarking he himself actually is a cheap son of a bitch, which will save them, saying he got his kitchen staff to keep a record of every meal that ever got served at the White House, recording all people who ever ate there, saying that log will prove Haney was at the lunch with him and Reynolds, and that it's in his presidential library in Ohio. Douglas remarks they better get to Ohio then. Somewhere else, the presidents arrive at a small railway station, walking in to take a piss. A man is absolutely shocked, seeing the two presidents beside him. Next, a man appears, saying their costumes are well made, but that they're late, saying once they get on that train, there's no sharing of tips until they're in Ohio. Hearing the train's going to Ohio, they say they'll be right there. Not long after, they join a party on the train. People remark it's spooky how much they look like the real presidents. A man reveals he thinks the real President Kramer is a piece of crap, and Kramer squirts juice on him, saying he's sorry, that it's a muscle spasm problem. Meanwhile, a girl tells Douglas she had a real thing for the real President Douglas once. Kramer walks up to him, and seconds later Douglas remarks they won't make it to his library, seeing agents. The agents get on board and start searching through it fast. Kramer and Douglas walk to the end of the train. Seeing them coming, Douglas says they have to jump, and start counting down from 3. On 2, he pushes Kramer off, remarking that felt good, and then jumps himself at the last second. Next, Kramer offers help, but Douglas doesn't want his help. Kramer smells food, and a couple minutes later, they find a gas station. Douglas asks Kramer if he can borrow $5 from him. However, as he orders a hamburger for $2 seconds later, Kramer asks if he's seriously borrowing $5 to pay too, remarking there's no wonder the Democrats screwed up the economy. They suddenly see agents and run. The girl remarks those two were presidents, but the boy asks of what. The two find a woman outside, asking for a ride. She replies it'll cost $50, which they don't have, so she asks to get his watch, and Kramer says she must be joking, that Gorbachev gave it to him. Having no choice, they hit the road, and Kramer remarks there were just 2 watches like that made, of which Reagan has one. A while later, a helicopter suddenly finds them, and she tells them to make a run for it. The helicopter announces they are immigration service, telling them not to run. Douglas is glad the chopper is not for them, but then suddenly another one appears. Kramer and Douglas remark that one is for them and runs. A Mexican calls on them, telling them to hide under the road. Douglas sees the boy is cold, giving him his coat. In return, he gives what helped him get to his new home America, saying it might help him find where he has to go. Suddenly the agents are coming, and the Mexican runs. The agents see him, and thinking it's Douglas, they start chasing him. The two remark they better get out of there quick. The next morning, Douglas asks Kramer what he misses most about the office. Kramer replies it must be Rita, the best cook the White House ever had. Douglas agrees her food is the best. Kramer suddenly says 80 million people voted against him the last time out, people who didn't trust him or liked him. Feeling it's heavy on him, Douglas then shares he stayed in bed a week after he lost, but then remarks they should stop talking since he'll vomit if they start bonding, and Kramer replies he should go to hell. Douglas asks what the time is, and Kramer says screw you. Next up, a man exclaims sweet Jesus seeing President Kramer appearing. They're all shocked, which doesn't get better when suddenly President Douglas appears too. Kramer quickly jumps into the car, and off they go. Douglas drives like he's done it professionally, but as they start looking at a map where to drive, they hear farting sounds in the back. Next, the father says if they had told them they were on a secret mission, they would have offered them help. They see a government car, and Kramer and Douglas hide. Some time later, when they can't help them further, the woman tells them that they lost their jobs due to Kramer's budget cuts, and then their home due to Douglas's economic downturn, saying she hopes they could do something for the people that have suffered to make things better. Douglas makes a call to Joe, explaining he's with Kramer and that Reynolds got killed, explaining how the NSA is trying to kill them too. Joe tells him to keep out of sight. They go to a local car rental business and rent a car. Kramer says he hasn't driven in years, and Douglas gets worried. Next, they're on the road again. As Haney is working out in Washington, D.C., Carl runs up to Tanner, explaining Kay Griffin is getting ready a report that Douglas and Kramer are working together to expose a major cover-up, saying he wants them stopped. Somewhere else, Douglas wakes up as Kramer has bought a coffee, and Douglas asks if he can have a sip. Kramer says he's not sharing it with Washington's love machine, from whose spit you can start a whole new civilization. He gets the lid to lick, however. Tasting its decaf, Douglas calls him a pussy, and gets out to go to the toilet. Moments later, agents appear. An agent tells Kramer he needs to step out of the vehicle, but Kramer isn't about to give up. He drives into their car, and picks up Douglas, asking if they got collision coverage. They then drive down a large sign, which stops the agents. Other agents pick up the chase, and eventually Kramer and Douglas have to leave the car at a dead end. They start trying to blend in a march, and a guy remarks this is amazing, but Douglas says not really, that they march in these things all the time. Douglas soon sees and understands it's a gay men's coalition, and another man comes up to them asking if they are coming out. Douglas says no, that he's always supported gay rights, saying it's Kramer that's coming out. Kramer asks if they're talking about him, and Douglas quickly says no. The man tells Kramer not to hide who he is, giving him a freedom ring necklace. They try to hide from the agents, and the man asks what's happening. Douglas says he can't help, unless he can get them to Cuyahoga Falls. He replies he can't, but that he's got some friends who might. Next, the two are on the road again, and a couple hours later, they finally arrive at Kramer's library. Not long after, Kramer finds the log, but sees Haney's name has been erased, remarking they have fiddled with the log too. They hear a noise, and turn off the lights. As a man walks in, Douglas hits him hard. But then Kramer sees it's Ben. Ben remarks he's never experienced a box spontaneously falling off the shelf like that, but then tells them a lady called, who left Kramer a message. Kramer reads it's from Reynolds' secretary, who says she doesn't know why Reynolds has disappeared, noting she trusts him, and wanted to tell he was the last person to speak to Reynolds, along with President Douglas and Carl Whitnor. Douglas remarks Carl is Haney's chief of staff, saying they gotta talk to him. Kramer asks Ben if they can borrow his car. A couple hours later, in Carl's house, while Carl is in bed with a girl, the two appear. They threaten them with a gun, and the girl runs out. Kramer says he's got one chance to explain what Olympia is and who's behind it, but Carl says he doesn't know anything. Next, they are arriving at Joe's home, asking for his help, and Joe remarks he never thought he'd see a Republican president holding a gun on a naked guy in a blindfold on his driveway. In an old stable, Joe explains his CIA buddies told him about this new technique, which is all brand new to him, saying he's not even sure about the dosage, but what the heck, saying it's probably not that important. Just pretending they'll torture him, Joe picks up a simple needle, acting like he's trying to find Carl's vein, and becoming real scared, Carl starts screaming he'll talk. Carl reveals he's behind all the fiddling with records. They ask about Reynolds, but Carl says it's all Tanner that's behind the killing of Reynolds, as well as their helicopter explosion. Afterwards, Joe explains they've got a confession on tape, telling them their best option is to lay low and go to the press, saying he can call Kay Griffin and by noon Washington will be up to its knees in Olympia. They decide to do what he proposes. But then Douglas gets angry, saying if they go public, Carl and Tanner will pay, but the real big fish will get away. Kramer says they've done enough already, but Douglas says he's tired of just doing enough, that he never had balls to do anything when he was in office because he was scared, saying he wants to go to Haney directly, even if they risk Tanner killing them. Kramer thanks God he never got that courage in office, saying his own loss would have been even more staggering, and then exclaims let's do it. Joe appears saying Kay is on her way over now, but Kramer says there's a change of plans. Somewhere, Tanner is informed Carl was kidnapped by Kramer and Douglas, and Tanner says they better reinforce the White House, that the game is over if they reach President Haney. Meanwhile, the White House cook Rita arrives with a lot of fresh food, telling the guard he can have a peek if he wants, which he doesn't need. Kramer tells Rita he almost got a heart attack when she said he could have a peek. President Haney is informed it's time for the ceremony on the South Lawn. Haney asks if they've heard from Carl yet, which they haven't. Kramer and Douglas are finally in the building. Douglas sees a group of people on tour, and to not be stopped immediately, he gets an idea. They walk up and Douglas tells them the tour guides are the hardest working people in the building, and to show their appreciation, they will lead them around themselves, making people excited. Tanner is told the presidents are here and that people have seen them, making it complicated since they've just told the news they are dead. Tanner says they can adjust the timing of the helicopter crash. Meanwhile, Kramer and Douglas are rushing the tour to get to the Oval Office, and Kramer remarks the old folks are dragging them down. Agents spot them and start chasing them. They run into a room and lock themselves in. Tanner is informed that they have locked themselves in, and he says they better keep them in there. In the room, Kramer says he found Haney, who's on the south lawn, but then they see the news saying they've just learned from the White House that President Kramer and Douglas tragically died in a helicopter crash. Douglas notes the phone is dead. Tanner is on his way with agents. Douglas asks what Kramer is doing, and Kramer says a butler once told him there was supposed to be a secret door called the Kennedy door in there, but it's probably just a story. Douglas says it's over here, that he almost forgot, saying he used it for a couple midnight rendezvous, telling a story about a stewardess, which Kramer doesn't want to hear about. As Douglas mentions she also was a contortionist, Kramer however gets interested, but Douglas says he can tell it later. Douglas says they better make it to Haney and show up on TV, then Tanner is out of business. At the last second, Tanner arrives and breaks down the door. Douglas says he knows the way out, but as they reach a dead end and turn to go back, Tanner appears. He points a gun at them and asks who wants to die first. Kramer thinks quickly and uses the sword, after which Douglas knocks him as hard as he can. At the north lawn, the two suddenly appear, and Kramer sarcastically compliments Douglas for his navigation skills. Kramer asks what now as they see agents arriving, and Douglas asks sarcastically back if he thinks he's MacGyver, saying he's making things up as they go. Next, they're stealing horses and riding across the lawn, getting blocked by agents. Tanner appears, telling his men to follow while he cuts them off. The two continue and Kramer says they'll have to come back when it's all over to search for his balls. Tanner says intruders are riding across the lawn, and snipers are told to shoot to kill. The snipers remark it looks like the presidents, but Tanner says the presidents are dead, that it's intruders. The two snipers aim and ask for his confirmation, and Tanner orders them to shoot. But one sniper sees something, a freedom ring necklace. He sees Tanner aiming to shoot, and changes his target, firing. Tanner falls to the ground, and the sniper remarks those two really are the real presidents. Kramer and Douglas continue to the south lawn, and Douglas jumps off his horse, walking up to Haney, saying they have to talk. Next, the three listen to the recording of Carl explaining how Haney needed to hide his kickback with the contractor from the Olympia meeting. Haney confesses he used the office, but says he can cut them in on the deal if they don't tell it to the press. Kramer angrily says he can't be bought, saying this office has done a hell of a lot for him, and now he'll do something for it, to get him out. Later, they meet the Secret Service officer who saved them, and they're glad to meet him. He tells them they've met him before, somewhere over the rainbow, and they begin to remember. A day or so later, Rita is serving them food when they see Haney resigning from office. As they're leaving later, Kramer tells Douglas he'll actually miss him. Douglas tells him to take care of himself, and not jump off any trains. Kramer says he was pushed, and Douglas remarks it's the same difference. A Secret Service officer tells Kramer it's amazing what he went through, and that he deserves a well-earned rest. Another Secret Service officer tells Douglas he did everything he could for the country, but then seeing the compass, Douglas exclaims that no, he's wrong, they didn't do everything they could. 9 months later, Kay Giffen reports that an unusual coupling has occurred, that President Kramer and President Douglas are running for office together, and will announce who's going to be president, and who's going to be vice president. Douglas says he'll do the announcement, but not trusting him, Kramer asks for confirmation he'll announce himself as Vice President Douglas, and him as President Kramer. Douglas says wait a minute, and they begin to fight over who's going to be the president. Douglas suddenly throws money on the ground, asking Kramer if he dropped it. Kramer says yes, and Douglas takes the opportunity to announce, and Kramer immediately rises calling him a son of a bitch. The end. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this, and hit the like button to help us out. Until next time, take care.